thank you for making it here. Appreciate it. We are doing a series, as you know, on the role that Presbyterians played leading up to the American Revolution. We are not going to cover, by the way, am I too hot? That sounds a little hot, huh? Let's try that. We're not actually going to cover the Revolution, you know that. This is just preamble, so we'll do that some other time. But we are going to get right up to the cusp of the Revolution, and that's the objective, and try to highlight the role that has been played at that time by those who are our predecessors in the Presbyterian movement. What we're saying here, I've mentioned before, would more or less be taken for granted at other times in our educational history, but I think you'll agree with me it's become a somewhat obscure point, so I'm hoping to rehabilitate a little bit something of that memory of the role that we played. So we talked about Calvin himself. Many would have said some years back that the founding of America in some ways was an extended consequence of the Protestant Reformation in general and the Calvinistic side of it in particular. That, of course, was originally the vision of Calvin. He didn't originate a lot of this, but he certainly gave it a new kind of juice, you might say, in the 16th century, and it was carried by John Knox, who was schooled by Calvin up to Scotland. The message that he proclaimed ferociously there in Scotland really transformed that nation, made Scotland maybe, at least for a time, the most advanced civilization in the world. Some would argue that. But eventually that, of course, was the vision that was carried across the ocean into our colonial experiment here. And so that's the story that we're telling. We're going to be shifting our focus beginning today and from this point on a little bit more to the colonial side of this discussion. So right now we kind of have our eyes on both sides of the ocean. We'll be looking at the three original colonial outposts here in America, beginning with Jamestown, and then we have the Massachusetts Bay and the Pilgrims there in between. Those three are the original colonial communities, all of them more the product of England than Scotland. So at this point we need to take a look at what was happening in England in order to appreciate then how the Presbyterians eventually show up and kind of work their way into the story as well. So that's what we're going to be about as we continue this morning. Each week I want to give you a biblical text to think about. This week it's only one verse. This is from King Solomon, chapter 21, verse 1 of the book of Proverbs, in which he gives these well-known words. You probably know them. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wants. It's hard to believe that sometimes. I don't know about you, but sometimes I find a little bit of a crisis of faith when I think about that. But nevertheless, that is what Solomon says, and that's certainly what we find affirmed again and again through the Scriptures. And I think we'll see some evidence of that today because we're going to be looking at some kings who are really going to be good examples of unintended consequences. What they intended isn't exactly what actually turned out to be the case. And it's a great encouragement to us, I think, to see how that sometimes happens. Well, let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Our Father, we're grateful to you that you have blessed us so mightily in this country in which we live, in this church in which we worship, in the great tradition that we enjoy and appreciate. We pray that our conversation this morning would serve to give us a better insight into the way that you've been working in history to bring us to this very moment. And for that, we give you thanks in the name of Christ. Amen. So, shifting our focus from Scotland down to England, and we think here about what's called Tudor Stuart England. No eyes are going to glaze over. This is important, and I want you all to be paying attention. Tudor England, 16th century England, famous for a lot of different reasons, most of which we're going to ignore. I've always thought about, from a religious point of view, Tudor England as a little bit like the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You have something that's too hot, something that's too cold, and from the English point of view, finally, it turns out to be just right. Too hot? Well, Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII, wanted England to become thoroughly Calvinistically Protestant. That was too hot for the English people. Too much, too fast. The successor, 5 years later, Mary Tudor, affectionately known as Bloody Mary, wanted to take England back to the church, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. For the English people, that was too cold, you see. And then Elizabeth came along, and she was just right. From the English point of view, I'm not endorsing this history. I'm just saying that that was about right. Just sort of, I don't want to say lukewarm, she wouldn't have said that, but they're somewhere in the middle. It was more to the English palate. Well, the story actually doesn't begin with Henry VIII. It starts a generation, or one king earlier, the father of Henry VIII, who is in fact Henry VII. Now, just a word or two about him. He was the king who won the Wars of Roses. It was a conflict between the Yorks and the Lancasters. He's a Lancaster. He won. He inherits a kingdom which had been somewhat beleaguered, just at the tail end of what's called the 100 Years' War. And the 100 Years' War had left a pretty bad taste in the mouths of the English people because the Pope had sided openly in a very partisan way with the French all through that 100 years, several popes, of course, along the way. And the English people didn't quite appreciate the fact that the Pope was a great cheerleader for France against the English. And so you might even say that at a very subtle level, that was the beginning of the English Reformation. Now, I want to be very cautious, don't want to push that point too far, but nevertheless, you might actually say something like that. In any event, England was not a powerful nation at that point, and Henry VII wanted to align himself with a powerhouse in Europe, and at that time it happened to be Spain. And so he organized a marriage between a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon and his oldest son, heir to the throne, Arthur. But Arthur died, and that left a very ticklish problem because it was illegal at that point under canon law for the widow, Catherine, to marry the brother, you see. And so Henry VII had to appeal to the Pope for special permission, a papal dispensation to permit it, which was granted. And so Catherine married Henry VIII, but Henry VIII was never quite so sure. I know we tend to look at him a little bit in a jaded way, and probably rightly so, but he was never quite sure that the Pope had done the right thing. He didn't like the Pope much anyway. Nobody liked the Pope very much in England anyway, you see, and so he wondered if this was really quite the right thing to do. And so this permission that was given by the Pope to have this second marriage between Catherine and Henry VIII had a little bit of a rocky beginning right off the bat. But to make matters worse, of course, Catherine was never able to produce a male heir. They had several children. They all died in childbirth, except one, Mary Tudor, who would eventually rule. But Henry kept feeling more and more uncomfortable that maybe this was God's judgment, you see. And finally, he wanted to divorce her and marry someone else in the hopes of a male heir, and the Pope said, no way. The Pope was very much influenced by the Spanish at that point, and so again, he was not prepared to give that permission. And as a result of that, Henry was looking for some justification to separate himself from the Catholic Church and from the Pope, and he was able to arrange that relying on Protestant scholars in England, most of whom were thoroughly Calvinistic. Calvin was kind of the new kid on the block at this point, and they were very taken in England, these university scholars, with Calvin, and so they cobbled together a justification for Henry to repudiate papal authority, divorce Catherine, marry Anne Boleyn in the hopes of producing a male heir, which, by the way, she didn't, you know, but that's another story. But anyway, that was the beginning of this shift. And at that point, we'd say under Henry VIII, you have a separation. The English people weren't too disturbed about that. Of course, there were some diehard Catholics in England who didn't like it, but for the most part, they were willing to accept this because of the sour taste they had toward the Pope anyway. Interestingly, the Church of England that was founded under the headship of Henry VIII at that point was quite Calvinistic. Lorraine Bettner says the influence of Calvin is shown in the 39 articles of the Church of England, especially Article 17, which states quite clearly and specifically the doctrine of predestination, you see. Cunningham has shown that all the great theologians of the established church during the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, his successor, Elizabeth, skipping over Mary there, were thoroughgoing predestinarians, and that the Arminianism of Laud, that's Archbishop Laud, who was 100 years later, and his successors, was a deviation from that. Now, my only point here is to say that at this point, whatever we think of Henry VIII, and I don't think very good things about him personally, but it was still a church that had a rather distinctively Calvinistic flavor, as was also happening in Scotland at the time. Not so much later, but at the time. All right, well, 6 wives later, Henry VIII died, I'm skipping over a whole lot of the story. I cover that in much more detail in our church history series we did some years back if you're interested. But this brings now his teenage son, who was not, of course, born by Anne Boleyn, but by a subsequent wife. He is a teenager. He's only about 13 when he becomes the king of England. He seems, as best we can tell, to have been himself, though a young teenager, quite committed to the Calvinistic Reformation. He was very much aware of it, a very bright kid, but not in good health. The scholars who surrounded him, plus the political leaders in the Protector government that was handling the rule of England while he was in his minority, the Duke of Somerset in particular, did all they could to help him maneuver England toward the Calvinistic Reformation. They were making slow, steady progress. It would have taken a long time because the English people moved slowly, But they were kind of going that direction, and unfortunately, he died. And so only about 5 years in, when he was still a minor, he's gone, and all the progress that had been made under Edward seems to have evaporated overnight, as the next ruler was Mary Tudor, aka Bloody Mary. She was as Catholic as was Edward Protestant, and so the whiplash now, you see, immediately turning around and trying to take England back to the Catholic Church. And that enterprise got underway, and Mary did it, kind of taking the bull by the horns here, launching this ferocious persecution on Protestant people in England. And this is where she won her epithet, Bloody Mary. Hundreds of people were burned at the stake, openly, publicly, men, women, children. Others were imprisoned or otherwise treated, very poorly under those circumstances. And what happened was that many of the people who could flee did flee. They abandoned their homes, abandoned their jobs, got out of town, got out of the country. And many of them went over to the continent and wound up in what amounted to refugee cities in Europe. Many of them wound up in Geneva, and they were welcomed as refugees in Geneva. Private people took them in, put them in the spare bedroom, that kind of thing. They actually were trained in various skills. Watchmaking kind of got its start there in Geneva at that point, famous to this day for clocks and so on. So this was what was going on. And John Knox, you may recall, was one of them. He'd been the court preacher under Edward VI, but now he himself had to escape. And so that's where they are. These are people now who have been Calvinistic in general, but now they're at the heart of the matter, and they can hear Calvin preaching every week, and they're sitting under his tutelage. And of course, over 5 years or so, they fully inculcate this Calvinistic vision. Not only does John Knox kind of incorporate that, but all of those who were there. This, by the way, is the proper beginning of what's called Puritanism. Now, Bruce Embry asked a great question last week, and I didn't get it. My wife had to explain it to me later, so Bruce, I apologize. I gave a lot of kind of around the barn answers because So I think if I remember right, Bruce's question was simply this: what's the difference between Puritanism and Calvinism? Or something like that. There is none. This is my answer. Puritans are English-speaking Calvinists. That's all. That's the only difference there is. And this is where Puritanism got its start. These are English people learning from John Calvin himself, and by 5 years later, they got it, along with John Knox, and they had an entirely different vision of what England should become, you see. And these people, when Elizabeth came to the throne, were waiting with bated breath. What is Elizabeth going to do? Is it going to be Edward? Or is it going to be Mary? And everybody was holding their breath. Protestant or Catholic? And of course, Elizabeth says Protestant. And all of these people in Geneva and elsewhere, refugees, breathed a huge sigh of relief, praised God, got on their boats, and came back to England. This is called the Elizabethan settlement, and they were so excited because now they had a real vision of what this Calvinistic form of government and monarchy, even, all of this would look like. So they returned with Calvin in their hearts, and of course, let's see, I need to advance one, keep these in sync. And they wound up going into the church, of course, in England, and what they found was that while the Anglican Church established under Elizabeth was technically Protestant, it felt very Catholic in its practice. Catholic ritual, Catholic culture, Catholic language, a lot of Latin. You know, in other words, she really did cut it right down the middle. Technically Protestant, substantially Catholic, the Anglican Church. And so these people who had come fresh from Calvin just tried to go to work seeking to purify the Anglican Church. And the people who didn't appreciate their work very much came to call them Puritans. It was intended to be an insult, but they actually didn't mind it much. And they came to call themselves Puritans over time. And so those are the people we're speaking of when we think of these who are Puritans. Well, they didn't open up kind of open hostility with the Queen. They were very appreciative of Elizabeth, and for the most part, they were very good citizens. But they did work in the church and also in the academic world in order to try to gradually shift the Anglican Church in the direction of Calvinism, and they became quite influential. They insinuated themselves into various levels of government, parliament, and so on, and they were really quite impressive people, and they had quite an impact over the 50 years that Elizabeth reigned. Thomas Macaulay, who wrote a book in the 1800s, he died in 1859, called The History of England, says of these Puritans under Elizabeth, quote, "Perhaps the most remarkable body of men which the world has ever produced." George Bancroft, we mentioned earlier, says of the same people that the English people truly became Protestant is due to the Puritans. I've mentioned Egbert Smith, his book, The Creed of Presbyterians, says the significance of this fact is beyond computation. English Protestantism, with its open Bible, its spiritual and intellectual freedom, meant the Protestantism not only of the American colonies, but of the virile and multiplying race which for 3 centuries has been carrying Anglo-Saxon language, religion, and institutions into all the world. All right, so the Puritans are treated well by Elizabeth. She's never a Puritan, you know. She has to carry on a kind of delicate political dance with these influential, very intelligent, very persuasive people, and yet she never quite sells the farm. You know, she's always maintaining her independence as the ruler and doesn't quite adopt the more constitutional approach that the Puritans might have been advocating. And then we skip by all that. You know, Elizabeth is wonderful. You got the Spanish Armada, you got Francis Drake, you got Shakespeare, all kinds of stuff. Skip all that. We're going to now come to the next ruler, and this gets us into the 17th century now, and the beginning of this colonial moment. So this is James VI, of Scotland. Elizabeth was the virgin ruler, right? No heirs, no offspring. So there was nobody that was immediately obvious to take the throne, and in the law of the day, it went to her closest cousin, who happened to be qualified to take the job, who was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. We touched on that a little bit last week. He's already been ruling in Scotland for some 30 years. He's a seasoned ruler by this time. He took the throne in 1567. John Knox preached at his coronation. He was 3 years, not John Knox, but James was 3 years old. And James, at least at the beginning, was willing to accept this kind of Presbyterian approach. Keep in mind, the influence of John Knox and Presbyterianism in Scotland had dramatically clipped the wings of the ruler. And as James grew up, he was increasingly aware that he didn't have quite the same arrangement with his people that other rulers in the world had with theirs. He had a much, much more limited kind of power there in Scotland, courtesy of John Knox, and he didn't like it much. The more he learned about it, the more James thought to himself, I like that divine right idea. I like the idea that the king can do no wrong. I dig that notion that the king is the law. And the more mature he became, the more impressed he was with how he was not getting the same kind of arrangement that others enjoyed in Europe. In fact, when John Knox died in 1572, James actually took a little bit of a push at trying to even curtail, maybe even push back the Presbyterians in Scotland and bring in more of the Anglican flavor. Well, the Presbyterians by then in Scotland would not hear of it. They were not going anywhere. They remained quite committed, and James was smart enough not to push it. He knew in Scotland, you serve as king at the pleasure of the people. The power to appoint and the power to remove rulers was in the hands of the people, and he figured that out, and that was the reality politically that he had to live with. And so even though that was the case, he continued to be the king and was a fairly competent king. On one occasion, Andrew Melville, who was a high church official, Presbyterian, Scot, said to the face of James VI, "You're just God's silly vassal." Isn't that a great line? You want to say that to the king, Just God's silly vassal. And what's James going to do? Because in fact, in Scotland, that's about what it amounted to. There we are. Okay. So, what happens? Well, he's been ruling for 30 years or so, and Elizabeth dies. It's 1603. Well, by this time, James VI, come James I of England, is a mature ruler. He's been, it's like the old saying, this is not his first rodeo, and he kind of knows what's going on. He hopes that now that he has been solicited to take the rule of England, maybe he can pull in England what he was never able to do in Scotland, you see. And so he is coming and he's going to rule Scotland from afar. He didn't have to move to London. He could have stayed and ruled England from, Edinburgh. But no, he decides to come to London, become truly the presence there, and rule Scotland from a distance, let those Presbyterians do what they're going to do. But he began to mildly encourage the bishops of the Anglican Church there in England to take a little bit more of a sort of enlightened view, as he saw it, of divine right and that kind of thing. The problem was that even he had problems in England, not quite the same as Scotland, but it was a parliament that was deeply influenced by Puritans. All through Elizabeth's reign, all through that period, they have become more and more powerful. And so when he tries to start pushing divine right against a Puritan parliament, he ran into the same kind of buzzsaw. Not quite as bad as Scotland, but nevertheless, they weren't really prepared to hear much of it. And so that's the game that James had to play. He was always a little bit out of step with the Puritans, but again, just as with the Presbyterians in Scotland, he had to kind of play the game and do it their way because he knew they had enough power that they could give him some real grief if he really challenged them in any sort of, upfront sort of way. Couple of details I want to throw in here about James before we leave him behind. One is that James established a beachhead of Scot people in Ireland. Scott Seifert wrote a book that we'll look at a lot more later, but he's commenting on this moment, and he says, James I confiscated 3.8 million acres of land in Ireland owned by Catholic nobles who then fled to France. James didn't like the Catholic Church, and he takes this move against Irish nobles. The land was inhabited by dirt poor Roman Catholic peasants, and James thought he could civilize them by sending Scottish settlers. These were all Presbyterians. He gave heavy inducements for Scottish Presbyterians who were knowledgeable in agrarian arts and that kind of thing to move to Ireland. And this is the beginning of what are called the Scots-Irish Presbyterians. We're going to use that term a lot, and indeed it becomes much more important later, but I just want to tuck into our conversation now. This is where it started. Okay, so Scots-Irish are true Scots, but they live in Ireland. They maintain their Scottish civilization, practice, and so on. But they were moved there really by James, who is trying to orchestrate something that will be of benefit to Ireland, and so that was why he did it. So they became the Scots-Irish. He did some other things. He negotiated what's called the millenary petition with the Puritans. One of the requests was to publish a new Bible. It's called the King James Version of the Bible. I grew up on it. Some of you did too, and so it's one contribution we can appreciate from him. He authorized companies, and there were two of these companies that were especially important because they both established a beachhead in the New World. The first of them, as you know, is called the Virginia Company, named for the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. And so honoring her, they took that name, they established a beachhead there at Jamestown. Jamestown was not religious in character. The official church was Anglican. The people there considered themselves good Anglicans. They were trying to do a money-making operation. Didn't work so well till they discovered tobacco. That whole story is kind of beside the point right now, but that's the first of them. The first of these public-private partnerships called companies, invented in Holland, but incorporated now in English life, became the basis for this first establishment. Now, here's what I was about to say a minute ago. In 1619, so some 10 years or so after Jamestown had been founded, some British pirates, English pirates, showed up on the shores of Jamestown. They had picked up in Africa certain people who had been kidnapped by African slavers and sold to these British pirates. They were intending to haul them across the ocean and sell them, as they often did, in the Caribbean. And so they got blown off course in a storm, and they wound up well north of their intended target outside of Jamestown. Well, the Jamestown people weren't quite sure what to do. They had some crooks, basically, English pirates. They had 20 or so people from Africa. And what to do? There was no practical way to send these African people back home. There was no practical way to do it. They didn't want to surrender them back to the pirates and become complicit in what amounted to a criminal enterprise. So they sat down and negotiated with these people from Africa a deal. Since they had shown up with zero, they had nothing, the shirt on their backs, was all they had. The deal was, if you will work here as indentured servants for 7 years, then we will free you, we will pay you a stipend for your services, and you're free to do whatever you want at that point. And they agreed. And so for 7 years, they worked as indentured servants. They were never registered as slaves. They were never called slaves. Indentured servitude is a very different animal. At the end of 7 years, they were freed. They all stayed. Most of them became quite successful in the Jamestown situation. Peter Wood wrote a book on this. It's entitled 1620, and he says of one of them, one was eventually freed, renamed himself Anthony Johnson, got married, raised children, became a plantation owner himself, successfully sued one of his white neighbors in a Virginia court. In other words, he was a member in good standing of the community at the time. And the myth that's been perpetrated of a kind of racial slave-oriented culture there is in fact false. I just want to say that for whatever it's worth to whoever you may be interested in that particular point. All right, that's the first of them. That is Jamestown. Now, some years later, you have what's called the Plymouth Company. The Plymouth Company was a religious enterprise, very much unlike Jamestown. These are people who were not Puritans because the Puritans, by definition, stayed in the Anglican Church. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church. And so they were working from inside, in the system, trying to have an influence there. There were other Calvinists who nevertheless turned their backs on the Anglican Church and established an independent, unrecognized, that is a church that was not officially recognized, and it was called Congregational in England. The Congregational Church was outside the Church of England, and these people therefore didn't have the same protections as the Puritans who stayed inside the church enjoyed. They were sort of frozen out of a lot of economic opportunities and so on, precisely because they were not in the Anglican Church. These people stayed under somewhat difficult circumstances under James I in England for a time, but eventually they said, enough of this, we need to get out of town, and they moved to Holland. And they were in Holland for some years, but they didn't like life in Holland because their children were starting to speak too much Dutch and not enough English, and they were losing them, you might say, to the culture of Holland. So what to do? Well, they thought, hey, that idea of a company worked pretty well in Jamestown. How about we try that? And so a new company was formulated called the Plymouth Company, and it was largely at the instance of these who were the independents. They were called nonconformists or independents, and they were congregational. And so this second company was formed, and again, James sanctioned it. So these people come over. These are the Pilgrims, not Puritans, but they have the same theology. They're just simply outside the church. That's the big difference. Again, Peter Wood says the Pilgrims survived, just as the school books for generations have said, because the Indians taught them how to live in their new landscape, but also because the Pilgrims fell into a useful place in the complicated chessboard of alliances and hostilities among half a dozen Native American tribes. All right, so those two elements, those two are the very first expressions of, you might say, the English-speaking world in the colonies. It all happens under James I. Okay, James rules until 1625, and that brings his son Charles I to the throne. And Charles is an interesting character. He is not as smart as his father, but he is much more deeply devoted than his father religiously. Okay? So Charles I, somewhat naive, I think historians would agree. He didn't know quite how to play the political game, keeping the Puritans kind of at a safe distance and yet acknowledging to some degree their influence. He was probably Catholic in his heart. He was married to a Catholic princess. He probably had a design something like Mary Tudor had, but he knew he couldn't push it that hard. By this time, it was way too late. And so he was trying to carry out, you might say, more or less on the down low, you're kind of moving England back. That was his hope, that was his design. Well, interestingly, what he did successfully was provoke a firestorm that would change all of English history, mainly because he was so devoted in his heart to his Catholic faith. So again, it wasn't what he intended, but it had a huge and long-term impact as history would unfold. So we need to take a closer look at him in the few minutes we have left here, and this is the reign of Charles I, 1625 until he was executed for treason in 1649 under the Puritans. All right, so this is Charles that we're looking at. We need to look at his story in two different points, first in England and then in Scotland. So first, England. Well, Charles did what every king did when they first gained the throne. He convened Parliament. Parliament was necessary to get tax revenue. Taxes were necessary to support the king. The king needed Parliament to authorize the tax. He couldn't do it on his own. And so Parliament was convened, and the first thing Parliament did was just openly question his loyalty to England, questioning especially whether he was in fact a closet Roman Catholic. And they pushed him hard and demanded from him certain concessions, basically painting himself into a corner that would, in a way that would prevent him from doing the very things he wanted to do. He didn't know how to negotiate very well. He was a pure-hearted guy, and the purity of his heart just made him get mad, and he basically dismissed Parliament and ruled for 11 years with no Parliament. Unprecedented in English history, you see. How do you do that with no money? He got a little money out of tariffs from imports. There were special kind of revenues to the throne. But most importantly, Louis XIII of France and Cardinal Richelieu, if you know that story, basically supported him, sending him a very healthy stipend and keeping him in power by this foreign money from a Catholic ruler on the continent. And that's how he kept going. Now, it wasn't very lavish, you know. I mean, this was kind of a tight budget, but he was able to rule with no Parliament now for 11 years. And because he didn't have to deal with Parliament, he could act a lot more like Louis XIII in his practices, which is sort of an absolutist monarch, just doing what he wanted. And there was really no one to curb his efforts because Parliament wasn't in session. He hired a bishop, Archbishop Laud, and gave him authority to basically openly attack and persecute Puritans in England, which is what he did. This is where some of the most horrific abuses of due process in English history ever occurred. The Star Chamber was an innovation at this point. All kinds of mutilations. People had their ears lopped off, their noses cut off, and various kinds of punishments and so on that were all authorized by Archbishop Laud in the hopes of intimidating the Puritans in England to return to a more heartfelt faith along Anglican lines. You know, that was really what they were trying to do. And so this was really a gruesome time. And it all took place under Charles with no Parliament to act as a check or balance. And Archbishop Laud is famous, infamous in history for having done all of that. Well, again, the Puritans in England are trying to, figure out what to do, and the idea came up of another company. And this company was going to be called Massachusetts Bay. And with private investment and so on, at least a sizable number of the Puritans in England trying to escape from this hostility from the Archbishop proposed this company, and it's agreed to, and they come across the ocean and establish what we call Massachusetts Bay. One of the most famous sermons preached was by John Winthrop, who was the governor in Massachusetts Bay, and before they actually got off the boat and settled there and so on, he preached this sermon, famously known as the City on a Hill sermon. It ends with these words, John Winthrop now, "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us. When 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory that men will say of succeeding generations, may the Lord make it like that of New England." See, that was the idea. This is a New England rather than the Old England. "For we must consider that we will be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all the people are upon us." Famous sermon, been repeated many times by many presidents down through American history, reminding us of that original vision, a city on a hill. And so that was the kind of Puritan side of the story, and that's as far as we're going to go with Charles in terms of the Puritans. But I want to just wrap up with what also happened in Scotland. This will take another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll be finished up. So he not only had policies of punishment in England, but he had policies similar in Scotland. So the counterpart to Archbishop Laud in England was sent to Edinburgh in Scotland, and the whole idea was he wanted to do in Scotland what he was doing in England, namely persecute these Presbyterians right out of existence. It's exactly what he was doing. He thought he could do it on both fronts, so he sends this fellow up to Scotland, and he came in with the authority of the sword, really, in Edinburgh to enforce, more or less, at the point of coercive power, the religion of the Anglican Church in Scotland. Well, the town council of Edinburgh, more or less in an in-your-face kind of a reaction to it, convened when this archbishop showed up and showed what he was planning to do. Arthur Herman, by the way, I mentioned him last week, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. All right, he's the author of that book. He begins his book. This is page 1. He gives the backstory behind this later, but he wants to start with this dramatic moment when this archbishop has shown up in Scotland. So page 1 of his book, he says this: in 1633, the Edinburgh Town Council decided they needed a new place of worship near the throne, or public scales, and designed as a Presbyterian church. It just happened to be just down the block a bit from the church where this archbishop was now trying to carry on his labors, you see. Having no associate to the Catholic past, nor would it be under the sway of the new Bishop of Edinburgh, appointed by Charles I to shove Anglican creed down the people's throats. So the Presbyterians in Scotland had been worshiping all these years in churches that had been Catholic once upon a time. And they never built other churches, they just used those facilities. There they were. But now you see, this archbishop is coming in and more or less co-opting them. And so the town council says, okay, fine, we'll build our own church, but you're not going to push us around. Well, what happened was for about 4 years, there was sort of a Cold War between the archbishop on the one hand and the Presbyterians on the other, but it finally erupted in 1637, so about 4 years later. And at that point, the archbishop read a prayer. You wouldn't think a prayer could be so incendiary. But this particular prayer essentially condemned the Presbyterians and announced that the Anglican Church was the only true faith, and kind of put down, in terms of a gauntlet, the sort of ultimatum to the Presbyterians there in Scotland. Well, the Cold War became more of a hot war at that point. The construction of the church got underway, but the citizens then flocked to sign what was called the National Covenant to take up arms against Charles. Now, this is where the Scots, you see, are going to put some shoe leather on their convictions, and they actually formulate this so-called National Covenant. If you know Scottish history, you've heard of the Covenanters. Richard Cameron later is called the Lion of the Covenant. It becomes virtually a synonym for the Presbyterians, the Covenanters. And this particular document is where that covenant sort of language began. The bishop himself was driven out of Scotland, driven back to London, and an open rebellion against him was mobilized that came to be called the Bishops' Wars, which took place from 1639 to 1640. This covenant was taken all through Scotland, all through Ireland, and everybody who was prepared to sign off became a covenanter. They were Presbyterians. Virtually everybody signed it. Some people would cut themselves and sign it in blood. And so this was a galvanizing moment in Scotland. This was because they had come to believe, as John Knox had clearly taught them, that people rule by the consent of the governed. You see, that the one who is in the position of rule is there at the pleasure of the people. And this, of course, was an assault on that particular proposition. So they hadn't approved this rule, they hadn't approved this kind of law, and that was what they used as a justification to react. Within this covenant document, it says, "We shall defend the same to the utmost, that power of the power that God has put into our hands all the days of our lives." By 1638, virtually everybody in Scotland had signed off on this document. In November, the Scots declared war on Charles. It wasn't really technically a declaration of war on England, but on the rule of Charles, you see, in Scotland. They were basically kicking him out. That was what they saw themselves as doing. Well, what to do? Charles summons Parliament. It's been 11 years, friends. And the parliamentary members have been, cooling their heels for 7 years. They were not in a good mood, you see. And so when Charles now, he needs money. He's got to fight a war. And he figures, well, now at least these people will recognize the desperate circumstances they're in, and they'll, up for some tax revenue so I can put together a credible army and go and defeat the Scots and bring them back into the fold. The Parliament said no way. In fact, this is called in history the Short Parliament. That's a term of art, if you ever hear that, because this Parliament met for about 5 minutes. That's not true. It actually met for about 2 weeks, but in political terms, it felt like about 5 minutes. And they said, as I heard one theologian say once, they started speaking Spanish. No way, Jose. They said, you are not going to get a dime from us based on the present circumstances and the hostility that you have shown toward us, Presbyterians. And so as it turns out, Presbyterians, Scots people, were able to defeat Charles using weapons like pitchforks and wheelbarrows. I mean, because Charles didn't have much of an army to fight with. And so at that point, Scotland became independent. Well, now, a very interesting thing happens about now. The English Puritans have had it up to here. This Parliament, called the Short Parliament, met for a brief time and convened. With the defeat of Charles in Scotland, Parliament on its own initiative convened itself. Now, technically, that wasn't legal, you see. It's supposed to be the king that summons the Parliament. But at this point, they felt that the circumstances were unusual enough that it warranted Parliament convening itself, and that's what they did. And that's called the Long Parliament. So in English history, you've got the Short Parliament and the Long Parliament. The Long Parliament lasts several years, you see. And they become the practical rulers of England. It's now parliamentary rule. It introduces an interregnum of the rule of Charles, and in fact, Parliament declares war on Charles itself. And so now Charles has even more problems at home than he had with Scotland. And that brings then our good friend pictured here, Oliver Cromwell, who of course is the leader of it was called the New Model Army in England to fight the forces that Charles was prepared to rally to himself to try to hang on to the throne. And that is where we're going to pick up our story next week. This has amazing impact, of course, in the colonies. The colonists are watching this very closely because their whole destiny hangs in the balance as to what's going to be happening now. And so it really is bearing heavily on our colonial story, even though it's still happening in England. All right, so we're done, at least for the first chapter of this little story. I want to get back to our verse briefly as we wrap up. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He turns the rivers of water, like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes. Hello, there we are. First thing to note here, the greatest comfort to the heart of faith is the sure conviction that the heart of the king and every officer who carries out his purposes is in the hand of a sovereign God. The Puritans were living under a series of rulers, and it didn't seem that any of them were very good guys. You know what I'm saying? Now, Elizabeth came off pretty well. Edward VI was good. But for the most part, these rulers did not seem to get it. They certainly weren't very supportive. And if you'd been a Puritan living there at the time, you would have had reason to scratch your head and wonder, If that's really true, you see, that the king is in the sovereignty of the king is in the hands of a greater sovereign Lord. But to their credit, these Puritan people did believe it and acted based on that premise, and their actions presupposed that there is a sovereign God who was in fact overseeing these events, so that they showed great courage, even in the face of some monumental opposition that they were facing. And it's a good reminder for us. You know, we've got various politics represented in this room, and if we were to talk to each other on that subject, we might have some interesting debates. But I'm going to tell you, whatever your opinion is, you see, of government at the moment, I just want to tell you this, that however you may feel about the present administration, the past one, or your senator, or your whatever, you see, it's all in the hands of a sovereign God. And that God has not gone out of business, he hasn't resigned, you see. And that even when we are dealing with circumstances, whatever they may look like, that seem a little bit oppositional, we should still rest confidently in that great truth. Number two, the greatest courage to the life of faith is the sure conviction that actions done in obedience to Christ are infused with power of a sovereign God who has ordained that action from all eternity. This is a powerful but somewhat subtle point. If you really believe that God is sovereign, then you agree with the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was written by that parliament that was the Long Parliament in England and published in 1649, which says in chapter 3, paragraph 1, God has from all eternity ordained whatever comes to pass. That even the things that are happening that on the face of it don't look very good are nevertheless God's work. And if you believe that of what's happening around you, then you can also believe it of yourself. This is the great mystery of God being sovereign and yet us being fully responsible. You can get up in the morning and say, today I'm going to serve Christ. I'm going to serve Christ today in spite of the resistance I may run into, and I'm going to do it in the knowledge that God has ordained from all eternity that I should do this very thing. And if that's what God has ordained, then won't he fill me with grace and power to do it well? And won't he give potency to my labors? And you see, that's what these Puritans kind of believe. It put steel in their backbones to believe that God had ordained their actions as well in the face of these kind of tyrannical circumstances that they felt. And then finally, the greatest confidence to the vision of faith is the sure conviction that challenges in the present moment are intended by a sovereign God to build the kingdom of Christ and glorify his name. So you take the first two and put them together. Opposition from outside, confidence from inside, and it gives us a great, wonderful drama in which to work out our faith with the expectation of a vision of God building his kingdom, and that we can do this in the sure sense that as we are faithful, God is continuing to establish the rule of Christ in this world until such a time comes, like as I like to say, quoting Isaiah, as the knowledge of God covers the earth, as the waters cover the sea. You've been very patient. Thank you. I'm done. I try to get done about now, which is about 12:10. And sometimes I have to scramble, but actually today I made it, so I'm congratulating myself. You know, thank you. But I do want to take, if you need to leave, it's fine, but if you have a comment, question, thought, rejoinder, footnote, debate, question, or... Yeah, I think so. Blair's question is, if you didn't catch it, the Episcopalian tradition, of course, which is the echo of the Anglican tradition, thought it was a very virtuous thing to do what Elizabeth had suggested, take the middle ground. That's what you're talking about between the two. Yeah, that we're in the right, and in some ways, I think that speaks to the English psyche, who they are inclined, you see, to a kind of moderation in things, you know, and actually pride themselves somewhat in it. And so I think they did see that as a virtue. The Calvinists, the Puritans, who had been exposed to Calvin, saw this as not a middle ground at all. They saw it as really a great compromise, you know, and so they didn't share that belief. But in terms of the general culture of England, they moved a lot more slowly than these people who had been exposed to Calvin. So it was kind of a hard sell, and I think from their point of view, it was a virtuous thing. So yeah. And if you go to an Anglican or a Episcopal church, I suppose that's the way they tell that story in history, is that was a great moment of virtue for their part. It's good, thanks. What I'm saying is it's...
Putting their arm around
yeah,
him,
no.
no matter who he is.
Yeah, good thought. It's the whole point is that what the king is doing on the face of it may not be at all what I would consider to be obedience to God or doing the right thing, but we can believe that God, who is sovereign, can orchestrate even through evil deeds good outcomes. We can't do that. God can, you see. So when Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for harm, God intended for good, we can say that of even what the king may do, which on the face of it we would take to be intending harm, but ultimately was going to bring out good. No, not at all. No. Good. I'm glad you mentioned that. I didn't.
Well, God's got his heart in his hand.
That's right.
He could have crushed him.
Exactly. That's right. It's like Daniel said to Belshazzar, the one who holds your breath in his hands. You know, that's idea. Philip. Yeah.
So, but God hardened the heart of Pharaoh.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It is. Yeah. And that's a good point. God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and we would say that the heart, and Pharaoh hardened his own heart. There was complicity in that, as you know. But did something good come out of that? Absolutely. The Exodus, the establishment of Israel. So, you know, we can't do it. This is kind of ends justifies the means. I'm not sovereign, so I can't get away with that, you see, ethically. But God is sovereign, so He can cause all things to work together for good. And so I can trust Him to be able to do what I am not authorized to do or able to do. And that's the sense of this right here. Thanks so much. Let's close in prayer and I'll let you go. Father, we're grateful for your mercies. We thank you for a fascinating story of history and the way that you've used various forces to produce good things. And we pray that we would see through the eyes of faith the way that you are doing these things even in our own lives, and would have the confidence and courage to embrace this as well, even in the small things that may occur to us or in the great things of politics. We pray that in all of these we would trust you with our hearts and with our minds. For all of that we give you thanks in the name of Christ. Amen.